Now, this week I recorded a very strong radio program based on Jeremiah chapters 2 and 23. The idea was, how would a prophet speak to us if he were talking to us in this generation? Not only to us as a public, but to those of us who carry the role of preacher, teacher, or what have you. What do they have to say? Well, while I was doing that, about the same time, I came on an article in Jewish World Review that was really striking and kind of revealing, in a way, of things I didn't know. The title of the article was The End of the Age of Reason. It was written by Rabbi Johansson Golson, which kind of sounds a little bit like a Swedish rabbi, but nevertheless. I'm often fascinated by the wisdom of the Jews. It's just as often that I forget what the source of that wisdom is. Sometimes I wonder if they know what the source of their wisdom is, because in this particular case, they have a lot of it here, and they don't cite what I think is the real source for it. But the Jews have a long history of valuing wisdom. And as a result, they've accumulated a lot of it over the years. You've learned a lot of things that are useful in terms of human experience by reading work by rabbis. But the title of this piece was provocative, and I was very curious about it. Here's how it started. Given how bleak our world now seems, the most likely psychological response would be at least confusion, perhaps panic, and understandably despair. But a review of the course of human history predicted over 1,500 years ago suggests an entirely different reaction. Now, what might that be? Because I would say panic, confusion, and despair really do characterize the way people have been in the autumn of this year. What does it mean, he asks, when the unwavering predictability of life and nature begins to falter? What are we to think when the expected no longer cooperates with expectations, when events seem to chart their own headings without regard for logic or history, when the laws of human nature, or the laws of nature rather, seem to redefine themselves without regard for the constancy of nature, when human beings increasingly demonstrate a disregard for rationalism and self-preservation? Now, there's a question for our own age. What in the world does it mean when everything is coming apart? All the stability, everything we've trusted in, everything we kind of believed in, is coming down around our ears. Everything comes unstuck. Well, he went on to say, 30 years ago, this is something I've thought about several times, scientists predicted that we were heading into the next ice age, until they began telling us that life on Earth is threatened by global warming. For a decade, the oceans calmed and lulled us into a forgetfulness of the storms that once ravaged our coasts, returning with a vengeance to strike not only the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean, but such unlikely targets as San Diego and Nova Scotia. Wildfires sweep again and again through California, the wealthiest state in the country, and perhaps the wealthiest state in the world. It did it even in mid-November. All of this is old news, he said, even as it continues to dominate the headlines. So is the global economy, so recently thought robust and secure, which has suddenly collapsed amidst a series of easily predictable blunders that were predicted by virtually no one. Now, there's a paradox. Easily predicted blunders that were predicted by virtually no one. Now, I thought that was an interesting observation. I hadn't considered it. But all of this should have been easily predictable. Why wasn't it? That said, the answer is probably staring us in the face. He went on to say, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, AIG, and others, the most secure financial institutions in the business, touted by the venerable finance magazine Barron's a year ago, only a year ago, as the most secure investments in the market. Think about that. All of a sudden, down they went. Hardly a thing that anybody really would have expected. Billions of dollars disappeared. The wealthy became impoverished. Even the big three automakers, the backbone of national industry, are tottering on the edge of insolvency. Now, when you put all that together, that's a pretty impressive picture he's drawing for us of of chaos beginning to develop, although, frankly, the wealthy becoming impoverished may be a little bit of an overstatement of what has happened. But he said, stranger than fiction, perhaps the most astonishing has been economic guru Alan Greenspan's confession that he has been forced to reconsider axioms he's held sacrosanct for the last 40 years. Namely, businesses can be relied on to act in their own self-interest. Did you understand what Alan Greenspan said? He had relied on the fact that businesses would act in their own self-interest. Now we are finding that that was not true. Since when do people, in businesses are just people collectively, act against their own self-interest? It's hardly a radical philosophy, one might have thought, but the recent discussions, the recent disastrous decisions of so many executives and so many institutions have prodded even the unshakable Mr. Greenspan to the brink of economic heresy. But you see, and I differ with the rabbi on this particular item. I really feel, and it should be plain to anyone, that the problem was created here not by the captains of industry. It was created by Congress. And you can go back and trace the legislation. It hasn't been all that long ago, in fact. I was shocked to find that while it would cost you to buy the basic Volkswagen, I think about $15,000 in this country, you could buy the old Volkswagen Bug, the one we all knew so well, in Mexico for $7,000. Why weren't we able to have that? Why couldn't we have that gassy, economic, inexpensive car, the Volkswagen, as they were called it? It was a wagon for the folks. Why couldn't we have it at $7,000? The answer is all the standards that our lawmakers that we elected and sent up there put on those cars for our safety. In fact, how about if they had just required all of us to take more defensive driving classes once a year or something like that? We could have seen to our own safety without having to spend double the price of a car, on it. But that's where we're at. I think really people saw it. They just thought that maybe we could ride on beyond it. And I think everybody knows by now, don't they, that it was the subprime mortgages that were virtually forced on us by Congress that put us in the situation we're in now. Now, I'll grant you that it got out of sight, out of mind, and nobody was paying attention to where it went. But anyway, he said politically, the rebirth of a broken and bankrupt Russia to join the ranks of the world's great economic powers in less than a decade and revive the Cold War echoes the rebirth of Germany under the Nazis in the 1930s. Now, I thought that was an interesting statement coming from a Jew, as it does. Similarly, the rise of a politician utterly unknown only 4 years ago, lacking any substantive experience or credentials to become the first African-American president of the United States would defy human imagination if it hadn't already come to pass. And indeed, he's right. I can't argue with that. If you had predicted this would happen, 4 years ago, that this would be what happened, nobody would have believed you. Now, he comes down to where he's talking about. He says the most likely psychological response would be confusion, perhaps panic, understandably despair. But a review of the course of human history, anticipated by the Talmud 1,500 years ago, suggests an entirely different reaction. Confidence. Now, I must say, I was totally taken aback by that conclusion. And when I got to that part of the article, I thought, well, I've got to talk about this to you folks, because how in the world would all of this lead to confidence? After reading the rest of the piece, I think what he was speaking of is what our reaction should be and could be, not what the normal psychological response could be, because all you got to do is look at the newspapers to find out what that is. What followed in the piece was what he called a partial list of what the sages of the Talmud had predicted the future would bring. He did it under the heading of the shape of things to come. He follows with a list of predictions from the old rabbis. Now, listen carefully to these as they go along and see if anything sounds familiar to you. A generation in which troubles flow like a river, growing stronger without interruption, clearly descriptive of a time when news headlines would report greater catastrophes from day to day and week to week. A generation when the halls of divine wisdom become houses of immorality, describing an age when depravity would become acceptable under the new religions of political correctness and non-judgmentalism, a time of feast and famine, suggesting an era characterized by unimaginable disparity between the wealthy and the poor, rapidly shifting fortunes from rags to riches, and new records as stock markets spike and tumble from one day to the next. Well, that sounds an awful lot like what we have been reading in the newspapers for some little time now, doesn't it? Surely does to me. Of course, that could be mere hindsight on the part of the author, but he is citing the old sages, the sages of the Jewish religion. Now, what struck me as I read it, though, that it was a prophecy, and being drawn from a prophecy much older than the Talmud, that when these prophecies were originally handed down, that they're citing here, there was no Talmud. And I was rather fascinated that nowhere in his piece did he ever cite a single scripture. He never cited anything from the Old Testament at all, of Isaiah or Jeremiah or anyone. He just cited the sages of the Talmud. And he's got to know that these fellows did not come up with this on their own. They didn't just imagine it. They didn't have a vision in the night. They knew that these things would come about because of what they read in the book. Anyhow, the description of a generation when the halls of divine wisdom become houses of immorality. Where'd that come from? Now realize, as I go on with this, that the prophets, as they're spoken of in this way in the prophets, were, the better word in English would be the preachers. The people who stand up and preach to the people. Listen to how he says this in Jeremiah 23, verse 9. My heart within me is broken because of the prophets, the preachers. All my bones shake. I am like a drunk. I am like a man whom wine has overcome because of the Lord and the words of His holiness. What God has told me has made me shake and tremble. For the land is full of adulterers. Because of swearing, the land mourns. The pleasant places of the wilderness are dried up. Their course is evil, their force is not right. For both preacher and priest are profane. Yea, in my house I have found their wickedness. Now, what are we supposed to think that means? Now, you might not have thought that Jeremiah was talking about the far future, but the Jewish sages read him that way. They realized he was looking on down to a later time. I know I certainly look at it that way. And they described the new religions of political correctness and non-judgmentalism. We mustn't judge people. We mustn't criticize people. The new religion could not bring themselves to condemn immoral behavior. Adultery, well, you shouldn't do it, but, we have to understand people are people. Homosexuality, yes, the Bible condemns it, but we mustn't judge. And so on it goes. They didn't mention that those who condemn it would become besieged like Lot was in his house in Sodom. That was really a shocking thing to me as I've been watching the news recently. Here's a church service going on in a church, and a bunch of gay activists show up down the front of the church screaming and yelling and throwing pamphlets in the air and making a great big scene in church. We have a woman who's had a cross yanked from around her neck and trampled on the ground. And it goes on and on. You've seen them yourself in the news. Did you think about Lot and Sodom? And how when he had the angels that came to Sodom, he asked them to come into his home. They came in, closed the door, and the people came in all around him, ready to invade his house, but dragged these guys out of there so that they could have their way with them. And until those angels smote them all with blindness so they couldn't find their way to the door of the house, they would have done it, but they were stopped. The parallel with what's going on in the streets of San Francisco today, I mean, it's right there for anybody who wants to look at it. Well, Rabbi Goldson continued, the sages tell us to look forward to a time when children will have no respect for their parents. Oh, do tell. My goodness. When heresy will become widespread and no one will give a rebuke for it. When the last penny will disappear from the purse. When those who trust in truth will wander like sheep. Do they now? Now, where do you suppose they came up with this? Where would the wisdom come from in their experience? Perhaps they've seen it, I don't know. But it might also have come from Isaiah chapter 3, verse 12. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. As for my people, they who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your path. Our leaders are taking us down this direction. And people are just following them like a bunch of dumb sheep. And so the sheep ultimately will be scattered. They trusted that they were being given the truth, and they're going to wander around like lost sheep in the end. The old rabbis didn't invent this stuff, you know. They had the prophets behind them when they made the statement. Isaiah chapter 3, verse 1. Behold, the Lord of hosts, does take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water. You're going to lose your food. The mighty man, he's also taking away the leader. He's taking away the soldier, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, the ancient, the captain of 50, the honorable man, the counselor, the cunning artificer, and the eloquent orator. Have you been to a museum to look at modern art recently? Even the talented artist is gone. He has taken away from us leaders in every phase of our lives. They're just gone. Now, you need to understand something. When it says that God takes these people away from us, it doesn't mean that He comes down and picks them up and takes them out. It doesn't mean that somehow or other He does something or has to press a button that makes it happen. It happens because of the way we treat people who try to lead the way leaders are supposed to lead. We won't follow them. We won't listen to them. And so the next thing you know, they're gone. When you make leadership too expensive for a person to exercise it, he'll stop. That's kind of where we are. Then he said this, I will give children to be their princes. Babes shall rule over them, and the people shall be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. Children will rule over babes. I think he means babes in terms of ability, experience, and all this kind of thing. That we no longer value wisdom. We no longer value the experience, the wisdom that comes from experience. What is it we're valuing in leaders these days? Their ability to speak well? Sometimes I wonder what in the world is going on in our minds. The next thing, the rabbis, by the way, got the idea from the same place the Apostle Paul got it. Paul said, 2 Timothy 3, mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, and then he goes on with a whole long list of ills that really kind of describe the world that you and I are living in right here, right now. By the way, this remark from Isaiah 3 that women rule over them is not a condemnation of women. What it is saying is the men are no longer willing to rule and the women have to. And we probably ought to thank God for the women, because somebody needs to provide some leadership somehow, some way. The next thing in the rabbi's list was interesting. He said, more cryptically, they tell us to look forward to a time when the generation has the face of a dog. Now, what in the world? Where would they come up with that? I was puzzled at first when I read this. Dogs are best known for their loyalty. The sages foresaw a time when an entire generation would have only the face of a dog, maintaining the appearance of valuing loyalty while essentially forsaking loyalty in favor of personal advantage and self-interest. Moreover, and this is what I thought was interesting, a dog walks out in front of its master, appearing as if it were the leader. The time would come, predicted the sages, when leaders would, dog-like, constantly look back for approval from the court of public opinion, standing out in front, but asserting none of the qualities of leadership. And boy, have we seen that. We live in the days of opinion polls. The leaders up there don't do anything unless they check the opinion polls. It's like the guy rushing around saying, have you seen a group of people wandering through here? Well, no. He said, well, I got to find them. I'm their leader, and I'm supposed to be out in front. And that basically is where we're at. Leaders want to know where we are and what direction we are, and they get out in front of us like a good bird dog. And dogs do that. If you're walking down the road, if you're walking north, the dog will be out in front of you. You turn and walk the other way, the dog will come and try to get in front of you again. It's handy if you're walking through an area where there are landmines. But if you're looking for leadership from your dog, you're looking in the wrong place. And I'm sorry, I'm afraid we're letting that happen to us right here, right now. I thought at first this was an original idea the sages had. But after I thought for a moment, I said, no, this also came from the prophets. Isaiah 56, verse 9. All you beasts of the field come to devour, all you beasts in the forest. His watchmen are blind. The people who we set up there to keep watch for us and watch out for us are blind. They can't see anything. They are dumb dogs that can't bark, sleeping, lying down, loving to sleep. And isn't that a dog for you? They get their chance to lie down, be quiet. Next thing you know, they're gone. I had a bird dog once that liked to sleep by my bed at night, and she snored so loudly I could hardly sleep. They like that sleep. They are greedy dogs. That's another thing. They can never have enough. Again, they are shepherds that cannot understand. They all look to their own way, everyone for his gain from his quarter. That's what the rabbis saw back in the law. And in truth, I had seen it without their help because I've been studying the Old Testament prophets for a long, long time. And all these things were there staring at me off the page. And now I see them day by day on the pages, right on my television set as they interview politicians. I see them in the newspapers. I see them on the Internet and my news I get. It's really kind of crazy in a way. It was at this point, though, in the article, I began to understand the references to having confidence in the presence of chaos. Rabbi Golson goes on. His subtitle here is The Irrational Imperative. Perhaps most significantly, the sages tell us that the Messianic era will arrive, and here's a Hebrew expression, Beshik Hadas, when no one expects it. Does that sound familiar? It should if you read your Bible. In an age when human resilience is strained beyond all natural limits by the tribulations of a world gone mad, when no one has attention for anything other than hopelessness has descended upon every corner of civilization, at that moment, the ultimate redemption will turn the tables on the pundits who prophesy imminent disaster and total devastation. So the confidence he's talking about comes from the expectation of the Messianic era. And they are right about it to a certain extent. There are aspects of it where I would differ with them. So would Jesus. But it did remind me of what Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 36. Of that day and hour knows no man, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Remember that? It's exactly what they're saying. It'll come when no one expects it. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And then the flood came and swept them all away. That's the way it's going to be. In other words, it will come totally unexpected, which is the same thing the sages were saying, although they saw a different world when it began to take place. Actually, there are some confusing elements in this and would bear study for us another time. Excuse me. Also, Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5, of the times and season, brethren, you have no need that I write to you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. Yourselves know this. When they shall say peace and safety, then comes sudden destruction upon them as travail upon a woman with child. And you know what I think as I read these things that Paul and Jesus said compared to what the rabbis said, we're only looking at this thing depending upon the time element. For there will be a time when business is going on as usual, and as at one point in time the whole thing goes down on the slippery slope to nowhere, to oblivion. And it's down that slope that the things the rabbis are seeing start coming to pass. Everything, they're seeing that, realizing that they're headed toward the Messianic age. Now, the expectation of the Messianic age is right on, although the playing out of the age differs, I think, from the rabbis to Jesus to Paul. But now Rabbi Golson adds a new element to his story, and I found this rather interesting. He said, indeed, this interpretation becomes even more compelling, given a more literal translation of the word, that expression I gave you earlier, Hesek Hadaas. The more literal translation is the failure of reason. Now, what in the world would he mean by that? Well, when no one expects it, was what his earlier thing was, and a failure of reason are not unrelated when you think about it. And he explains it this way, with history, naturally. The great philosopher Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler observed that when we fail to recognize the hand of the Almighty in the blessings He bestows upon us, we may compel Him to force our recognition through the travails to which He subjects us. Yeah, I can see that. I see it more as a matter of you go on thinking you don't need God, and eventually God says, oh, you don't need me, well, then I will withdraw my blessing. And when the blessing goes away, when the hand of protection goes away, then disaster is what inevitably follows. He said, as he witnessed, this Rabbi Dessler witnessed the specter of Nazi Germany from his home in northern England, Rabbi Dessler recognized the shadow of divine retribution sweeping over Europe during the Holocaust. To his discerning eye, the meteoric rise of a failed painter who in 6 short years resurrected a broken German nation and built the continent's greatest military power revealed the hand of providence as clearly as any open miracle. Well, maybe. But then he goes on to say this. Reason had failed European Jews. That's what he means by the failure of reason. Year after year after year, we've been blessed and blessed and blessed, and we come to the place where we really assume it's because we're so smart, because of who we are, because of what we can do, what our skills, our experience. It's all because of us, right? That's a failure of reason. The Jews had failed to see the Almighty's presence in their midst during the many years of prosperity they had enjoyed before Hitler came to power. In a supernatural reversal of fortunes, the unreasonable suffering of millions forced them and us to look at the world through entirely different eyes. History demands that we learn its lessons, and history has little patience with us when we don't. I differ with him a little bit in this regard. I think what happened in Europe is a natural result of men forsaking God. I don't think God has to lift a finger. I don't think He has to press a button on His console to make these disasters come about. They come about when the people of God are no longer acting like, living like, conducting themselves as the people of God, and when they are no longer looking to Him, praising Him, thanking Him for what He's done. I think this is true. He goes on to say, whether the era of ultimate redemption will arrive heralded by divine emissaries descending from the heavens, or humbly, as the prophet says, riding on a donkey, either way, the inexplicable seismic shifts in climate, economics, politics, and human psychology warn us to expect the unexpected, of course. But how do you do that? How do you ever get to where you can expect the unexpected? To trust in neither our intellect nor the might of our hands, but only in the merit of our good deeds, our concern for our fellow men, and our commitment to the sanctity of divine law. It's true. Now, I will rephrase some of what he's saying here, because it isn't the merit of our good deeds that's going to get us salvation. But the point is, our salvation in this world, the here and now, may have a lot to do with our good deeds and how we have actually gone about caring for people. He says, by following this prescription, we can be confident, not of an easy passage, but of a safe and secure harbor at our journey's end. To a Christian reader, it will strike you, I think, as true. Zechariah 9:9 is the prophecy they're talking about. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He is just, having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Now, I've explained this before. Bear with me. In ancient times, a horse was an instrument of war. It was not something used for transportation. And so when the king comes riding upon a horse, he is seen coming to fight. When he comes riding upon an ass, he is seen as coming in peace. This is why in the Old Testament you will sometimes find references to the king's mule as opposed to a horse. That is a means of transportation, not something you use to fight. So that's the references that are here. Then in Matthew 21, verse 1, where this is cited, that when they drew near to Jerusalem, they get close to the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent his 2 disciples and said, "Go to the village opposite, and straightway you'll find an ass tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them to me. If somebody says to you, 'What are you doing?' say, 'The Lord has need of them,' and immediately he will send them." All this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king comes unto you, meek and sitting upon an ass, and a colt, the foal of an ass." The disciples went and found as Jesus commanded them, and he brought it and set him on it, and then he went into Jerusalem with people shouting, "Hosanna," children cheering his arrival, with people actually putting palm fronds and their coats down in the roadway for him to walk over. I thought the rabbi's conclusion was especially telling, and it spoke to the fact that ultimately we share the same God. We interpret things differently, but we still serve that God of Abraham. He said, "The inexplicable seismic shifts in climate, economics, politics, and human psychology warn us to expect the unexpected, to trust in neither our intellect nor the might of our hands, but only in the merit of our good deeds." And I think by this, but we need to be giving attention to how we treat one another. He goes on to say, and our good deeds and our concern for our fellow men and our commitment to the sanctity of divine law. In other words, we commit to actually ordering our lives according to the instruction that God has given in the book regarding the way, that we recognize that the law of God is a testimony to how a person should live his life. And we respect that. It reminded me of something that Paul warned about in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Remember this one? "If I speak with the tongues of men and angels but have not love, I am like a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. All the speech, all the tongues, all the oratory means nothing without love. If I have the gift of prophecy, I can fathom all mysteries, all knowledge. If I have a faith that can move mountains, and I don't have love, I'm nothing." People can pursue prophecy all they want. They can write up their doctrinal papers. They can lay out their charts. And I don't know how many of them I've seen over the years in different colors and pencils and diagrams and so forth of 1,260 days and 42 months and 1,335 days, and on it goes. I've seen it again and again. They will still, all these people will be totally blindsided by the return of Christ if they aren't acting day after day after day with love. I had a surprising call last night, a little bit before bedtime. It came from a fellow that I had just taken some instruction in, some firearms instruction with him. He taught, teaching us how to shoot a handgun. Interesting fellow. It turned out, had been listening to my radio program along the way. And he called me to talk about something that had struck him and he had never really quite gotten before. It came from my program he'd just listened to Sunday morning. And what he said was, in Matthew 25, where he separates the sheep from the goats, he turns to those on his right hand and he says, "Blessed are you, my Father." And he ticks off one by one the things that they had done. He didn't just group them together. He actually specifies what they were. And what had struck him for the first time, and he'd never really thought about it, was when they said, "Lord, when did we do this?" They didn't think about it. And the only reason he could see was because every day of their lives, that's the way they acted toward people. To them, this was normal, not worthy of praise, not worthy of reward, not worthy of anything. It was just doing the right thing. And I told him how much I appreciated his call. Because while I had seen it, I thought the way he put it was a little different and worth knowing. It all boils down to how we treat one another. And it is not just going through the motions. Your heart has to be in it. If I give all I possess to the poor, if I surrender my body to the flames and I don't have love, it profits me nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. You know, this year at the Feast of Tabernacles, I have characterized it to others, and they've said they've echoed what I said. It was the warmest feast that I really can recall ever attending. I don't know altogether why that would be so. I was just very, very grateful that it was. It was warm because the people who were there really have, over the years, become almost like family. The feast is becoming like a family reunion for us. And there was love there. People cared about one another. And it's just really kind of wonderful thing to see among people. Love does not delight in evil. It rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Doesn't give up. Doesn't say, I'm going to walk away. I'm going to persevere. Love never fails. Find prophecies, they will cease. They'll fail. Where there are tongues, they'll be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it'll pass away. I'm afraid that's a little too true. And sometimes we think we got it all lined out. We know, only to find out we didn't have it quite as right as we thought we did. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. And right there, I guess, is the answer to this issue of looking down toward the end times and the expectation of the Messiah. We know in part. And because of that, we will not and must not be totally blindsided by the return of our Lord. We will see things happening and we'll know what's coming down. And consequently, we will have that confidence that the rabbi was talking about, as opposed to the confusion that most of the people around us will be experiencing at that time. I think it's really important for us to realize these things. Where there are prophecies, they'll cease. Where there are tongues, they'll shut up. The prophecies are going to fail. We have it all worked out. No, we don't. We know in part. We prophesy in part. When that which is perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish things behind me. I guess the failure of reason is because we have found ourselves reasoning like children. But now we see a poor reflection, like a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Now there remain these three: faith, hope, love, and the greatest of these is love. When the rabbi spoke of the failure of reason, he was not advocating reason as a savior. He was talking about a kind of willful blindness, a commitment to this world and this society as a safe place. That we put down our roots. We feel secure. We've found a community where we can live. It's like a person gets into a gated community where he feels totally safe where he is. The problem is this world is not safe. It never can be safe. It is utterly impossible for it to be safe. His closing words, I thought, were quite apt. By following this prescription, we can be confident, not of an easy passage, but of a secure and safe harbor at our journey's end. It's a testimony to God's constancy that from the prophets to Jesus to Paul and to a degree even to the sages in the centuries following who wrote the Talmud, the message is the same. There is no easy passage, but if we're faithful, there is a safe harbor at the end.